As Naomi and Ruth travel back, they decide to take up residence just outside of Bethlehem. They have absolutely nothing. They have no means to earn money. They have very little food and supplies. They have what they were able to bring back with them, because women during that time in history did not have the same privileges as men. Therefore, they really didn't have a way to provide for themselves. So Ruth, being loyal to Naomi, understands that she has to go and find a way to feed them. So she goes and she begins to glean and gather grain inside of a field that's just outside of Bethlehem. She is picking up the leftovers of the leftovers. Whatever was left behind, that was left behind the gleaners. Because see, you had your first gleaner that would go out and they would glean. And then they had someone that would come behind them and pick up what the first gleaner left. Then they would have someone who would come behind the second gleaner and pick up what the second gleaner had left behind. And so Ruth is basically playing fourth string here with gathering up the grain for her and Naomi. Whatever was left of the leftovers is what she was able to bring back. And she did this consistently. She did this for days at a time. She began to continue to pick up this grain and be faithful and be loyal to Naomi. Boaz begins to recognize this. He's walking his field, which was it's very normal for businessmen to walk in and out of their businesses. This was Boaz's business. He owned numerous properties that he would grow fruits and vegetables and grains on, because he was a man of agriculture, that he would have had numerous properties, and he would have walked those properties to make sure that his workers were doing what he asked of them and making sure that they were being honest and that they were being taken care of. And so over a series of time, he notices that Ruth is very consistent in coming in and picking up the leftovers of the leftovers. And he tells his workers, I believe that she's a widow or she's destitute. Let's leave a little bit extra behind. And in the book of Deuteronomy, it actually talks about how family or businesses or men who owned land should allow the widows to come into their field and glean from their fields. So Boaz, being a man of God, being a man who understood Scripture, would have allowed Ruth to glean from his field because she was a widow. So he allows her to pick up, and he tells them, don't just leave her the leftovers of the leftovers of the leftovers. Begin to allow her to pick up the better pieces of grain. So Ruth comes back. She has more grain than usual, and Naomi's like, where did you get all this from? And Ruth explains to her that she's been working at a field outside of Bethlehem. And Naomi begins to put the pieces together and realize that Boaz is a distant relative. And as a distant relative, he would have the opportunity to marry Ruth. So Naomi begins to realize that Boaz is a potential kinsman redeemer to Ruth. So that's where we enter this term, kinsman redeemer. A kinsman is someone who is close to you in family relation. A redeemer is someone who rescues you, who saves you. Boaz was a close redeemer, and he was also in a position to rescue Ruth and Naomi. So that is where we get the label for him as a kinsman redeemer. So Boaz continues to allow Ruth to come and gather the grain, and Naomi continues to connect the dots. And she tells Ruth in chapter 3 in the book of Ruth, go wash yourself, anoint yourself with oil, put on perfume. In today's term, it would be make yourself presentable. Put your best foot forward. And then she tells Ruth, go down to the threshing floor. Wait until Boaz has finished his evening meal, finished eating and drinking and taking care of whatever business he needed to take care of that day. Wait till he falls asleep, then go and sleep at his feet. That's significant because it showed humility on Ruth's part. It showed that she was willing to submit to the authority of Boaz, that she was willing to put herself beneath him to show respect and honor. She didn't lose dignity in this. She did not lose her sense of self. Rather, when she humbled herself, God took this opportunity to awaken Boaz and cause the light to come on with him and realize that here is this woman who is a distant relation to me. Because he wakes up in the middle of the night and he's like, who are you? Can you imagine waking up in the middle of the night and finding a strange person at your feet? That would be really odd in today's time. However, because of Ruth's obedience, God blessed that. And so Boaz wakes up. He realizes that there's this woman at his feet. And Ruth says to him, my name is Ruth. I am Naomi's daughter-in-law, and you are my kinsman redeemer. So Boaz, being an educated man, knowing the law, realizes that he is a kinsman redeemer, yet there is one that is closer to being a kinsman redeemer than he is. So he tells Ruth, I have to go into the city, I have to conduct business, and I have to see if the other kinsman redeemer wants to redeem you. If he does, then he will have the right to marry you. If he does not, then I will marry you, and I will petition to be your kinsman redeemer. So Boaz goes into the city, and he goes and sits at the city gates, because at that time of history, everything that was business related took place at the city gates. And so Boaz goes in, he conducts business at the city gates, and he calls a council, because you had to do everything business related in front of witnesses when you're exchanging property or making petitions for marriage, because they were legal binding documents. So this other kinsman redeemer is in this group. Boaz is in this group, and there would have been leaders from the local Jewish sect at that group also. And Boaz makes a claim, or he brings forth the story of Ruth and Naomi, and he informs the other kinsman redeemer and says, they're in need of rescue. If you're going to rescue them, this is your opportunity. The other kinsman redeemer decides not to do it. He couldn't do it. He didn't want to do it. He didn't desire to do it. So he takes off his sandal and he gives it to Boaz. At that time in history, removing of the sandal and exchanging that is making that contract, that agreement, legal and acceptable. So Boaz receives this sandal and exchange land for the hand of Ruth. It's basically like a dowry. He exchanges those property for property. Not that Ruth was property, but he exchanges the property for Ruth's hand in marriage. And he goes back and he makes a claim for Ruth and becomes her husband. And the coolest part of this, remember I told you about the word typology in the very beginning? The coolest part of this is that Boaz and Ruth represent Christ and the church. And the reason we know that is because in chapter 4, it very clearly outlines the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Really? At the end of chapter 4, we see there in verse 13, it said, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and they became one. So out of their oneness, they had a son, and his name was Obed. And Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. And out of the line of David comes Joseph. Joseph may not have been Jesus' biological father. However, Joseph was Jesus' earthly father. And as a result of that, Jesus would have had all the rights that Joseph had. So even though Joseph may not have been Jesus' biological father, he would have been recognized as his son. And if we go fast forward to Matthew chapter 1, all the way at the bottom of the genealogy there in Matthew, in verse 16, it says, "And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus, who is called Christ." So Joseph was the line all the way back to Ruth and Boaz. And that is how God the Father begins to establish himself here on earth through two people who operated through obedience, who operated through humility, who were loyal to their faith, who operated as Boaz operating as the kinsman redeemer, and represent a typology of Christ redeeming his church. Just as Boaz redeemed Ruth, Jesus, being born, redeemed people from sin and harm. Isn't that amazing how the Old Testament comes in and becomes alive in the New Testament, and how history and God intertwine everything so closely together, all for our benefit, for our success, and for our purpose here on earth. He truly desires to manifest himself here on earth as in heaven,